It happened so fast she never even saw the hand that struck her. There was just a sudden sharp crack that echoed in the quiet kitchen, a sound like a dry twig snapping. A fiery burst of pain exploded on her cheek, and Ruth Avery stumbled back, her vision blurring at the edges. Her small hand shot out, desperately gripping the worn edge of the wooden table to keep from falling. She struggled to stay upright, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. But even stronger than the blood was the familiar, bitter taste of fear. Still, she refused to make a sound. She had learned a long time ago that screaming only ever made things worse. Can you imagine being so afraid that you cannot even cry out for help? Let us know in the comments, and keep watching to see if a hero finally appears. Her stepmother's breath was hot on the back of her neck, a cruel, close presence just waiting for her to make another mistake. So Ruth kept her eyes locked on the scuffed floorboards beneath her feet. Her thin shoulders were pulled in tight, her entire body braced for the next impact that she knew was only moments away. A tiny, desperate plea escaped her lips, a whisper so quiet it was barely there. It did not matter. Her stepmother's hand was already raised again, a dark shadow against the dim light. But this time something was different. A stranger heard her burn. A man's voice, calm and steady, cut through the terrible silence. A voice she had never heard before. It was a voice she was not sure she could possibly trust. Why was he stopping this? Why was he helping her? Why now? As if in a rage, Martha Avery shoved Ruth hard toward the doorway. The little girl stumbled forward, catching herself on the door frame to keep from sprawling onto the floor. She could feel her own fingers trembling against the splintered wood. She could already feel the next hit before it even happened. Sensing the very air shift as her stepmother prepared to swing again, Ruth squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable pain. But it never came. Instead, a different hand appeared. It was a large, steady, and completely unfamiliar hand. It closed firmly around Martha's wrist, stopping the attack in midair. The world seemed to go completely still. Cautiously, Ruth opened her eyes, and what she saw took her breath away. A man was standing between them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a layer of travel dust on his sturdy boots. There was a deep calm about him that somehow felt more dangerous than any anger. He did not raise his voice or even move back an inch. He simply stood his ground, a solid presence in the tense little room. He held Martha's arm with a quiet, confident strength, the kind you see in a person who has nothing to prove to anyone. "That's enough," he said, and his voice was low but carried absolute authority. Martha violently jerked her hand free from his grasp. Her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Just who do you think you are?" she shrieked. "This is my house, and she is my responsibility. She will do exactly as she is told." The man did not even bother to look at Martha. Instead, his kind eyes were fixed directly on Ruth. Frightened, Ruth scrambled backward on the floor, trying to put as much distance as she could between herself and the two adults. The burning on her cheek was a throbbing reminder of the pain. Her heart was thudding so loudly in her ears it was all she could hear. She had no idea whether she should run away or just freeze in place. The stranger finally turned his head slowly to face Martha. His voice remained perfectly calm, but beneath that calm tone there was a core of pure steel. "Do not hurt her again," he commanded. Martha let out a sharp, ugly bark of a laugh. It was a sound that held no humor at all. "She is my problem to deal with," she sneered. "And unless you plan on fixing that problem for me, you can get back on your horse and ride on." Without a word, the man reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened the wallet, his movements deliberate. Then he said three words that made the entire world crack wide open. "Sell her to me." Ruth just stared at the stranger, the breath completely trapped in her chest. She could not possibly understand what was happening. It had to be a nightmare or some kind of strange dream. It had to be a mistake. People did not buy other people. Not in this day and age, not in this town. And yet, this stranger stood there, as calm and solid as a stone, waiting for Martha to give him an answer. Martha's eyes, which were usually just cold, went through a shocking transformation. First, they narrowed in suspicion. Then they widened in complete disbelief. And finally, they sharpened with a raw, ugly greed. "You cannot be serious," she hissed, her voice a low whisper. The man's gaze was like steel. He did not even blink. "Every person has a price," he said calmly. "Name yours." A tiny broken sound escaped Ruth's lips. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am not something to be sold." She finished her thought, her heart breaking. "Not something you can just buy." For the very first time since he had arrived, the stranger turned his full attention to her. His eyes met hers and his voice, once so firm, softened with unexpected kindness. "No," he agreed gently, looking right at Ruth. "You are not." Then his gaze snapped back to Martha, the softness vanishing instantly. "But let us be honest. She is not safe in this house with you, and you know that perfectly well." Martha scoffed and crossed her arms over her chest in a show of defiance. But her act was unconvincing. Her eyes were completely glued to the thick leather wallet in the man's hand, practically devouring it. "She's a lazy girl, completely useless," Martha spat, her words dripping with venom. "She is far more trouble than she is worth." But the man refused to be drawn into her petty cruelty. He completely ignored her insults. Instead, he began to count out crisp bills, his movements deliberate, slow and steady. With each bill he laid down, Ruth watched the stack of money on the table grow, a physical monument to her own worthlessness in her mother's eyes. A tight, painful knot formed in her stomach. Her mind screamed in denial. "This is not happening. This cannot possibly be real." Then the man stopped counting and quietly spoke a single number. The sound Martha made was a sharp, greedy gasp of air, as if she had been punched. Her calloused fingers twitched with the desperate need to grab the cash. "You would truly give that much money?" "For her," she finished, her voice filled with awe. The man's reply was simple and firm. "I will." At those words, Ruth felt all the strength drained from her knees. The wooden floor beneath her feet seemed to tilt and sway. She whispered the words one more time, a desperate, final plea. "Please, no." The stranger did not look at her this time. He kept his focus on Martha and said softly, "Not yet." His gaze remained locked on Martha, cold and unyielding. "Here is the deal," he stated plainly. "You take this money, all of it, and in return, she walks away from this place. She leaves with me today. In fact, she leaves right now." Before he could even finish his sentence, Martha lunged for the pile of bills like a starving animal, snatching them up. "Fine, she is yours now," she snarled, stuffing the money into her apron. "Good luck to you. I promise you will live to regret this." The man did not even grace her with an answer. He simply turned his back on Martha and walked directly to where Ruth stood frozen. He slowly crouched down, bringing himself to her level so she would not have to strain to look up at him. Every one of his movements was slow and incredibly careful, as if he were approaching a frightened deer that might bolt at any sudden sound. "Are you able to stand on your own?" he asked, his voice low and calm. She managed a small nod, even though she honestly was not sure if her legs would hold her. Seeing her hesitation, he offered her his hand. He did not grab for her or push her in any way. He simply held his open hand out, palm up, leaving it there like a silent invitation, making it clear that the choice was entirely hers to make. After a long, hesitant moment, she finally took a deep breath and placed her small, trembling hand into his large, warm one. He helped her to her feet so gently. He supported her as if she were made of the most delicate glass, as if he were afraid she might shatter. "Go get your things," he murmured softly. "We are leaving this place right now." Ruth slowly turned and looked toward the rickety old cabin. It was the only home she had ever known, a place that had inflicted so much more pain on her than it had ever offered her comfort. Her heart was pounding like a drum against her ribs. Her breath came in short, shaky gasps, and her legs felt as heavy as blocks of iron. To leave meant stepping into a world she did not know, a complete and terrifying unknown. But to stay meant enduring the same old heartache, day after day. She drew in a small, steadying breath. She took another deeper breath, gathering her courage. Then, with a newfound resolve, she took a single, determined step toward the cabin door. Ruth reached out and pushed it open. Her hand was shaking, but she pushed the heavy wooden door open anyway. The familiar musty smell of old wood smoke and settled dust filled her nose. It wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, a collection of memories she was desperate to leave behind. Her legs still felt unsteady and weak as she moved inside. With great effort, she climbed the small, rickety ladder that led to the cramped loft where she slept. As her head cleared the floor, she looked around the little room. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The ceiling was so low she could touch it. The blanket on her cot was thin and worn, and the single window had a long crack in the glass. But something was different. Tonight, seeing it through new eyes, it felt completely different. It no longer felt like her room. It felt like a cage, a place she had to escape from immediately. From its hiding place, under her thin pillow, she pulled out her most prized possession, her own mother's silver hairbrush. After tucking it away safely, she carefully folded her only spare dress. She carefully took her father's old, worn Bible, the one precious thing she always kept close to her heart, a link to a kinder time. These three small belongings completely filled her simple flour sack. This small bundle represented her entire life's possessions. Just three simple items were all she had in the world. As she stepped back down the rough-hewn ladder, her heart was pounding in her chest. Martha stood blocking the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes were shining with a furious, hateful light. But beneath the anger was something even uglier, a raw and hungry greed. "Hurry up and get out," she snapped, her voice like a whip. "You have wasted more than enough of my precious time." Ruth clutched the sack with both hands, holding it like a shield. She knew it was best not to speak. Saying anything would only feed Martha's terrible rage. The stranger waited patiently at the gate. His horse was already saddled and prepared to leave. He pointedly did not look at Martha. His gaze was fixed only on Ruth. "Are you going to be all right?" he asked her gently. She could only nod, feeling as though her heart might break right through her ribs. He took the small bundle from her hands with care and securely tied it to the back of his saddle. Then he gently helped her up, guiding her worn-out shoe into the stirrup. She felt terribly clumsy, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She was lightheaded from the shock of it all, but his strong, steady hands held her firmly until she was secure. Once she was properly seated, he gracefully mounted the horse behind her. His arms came around her to take the leather reins. But he was careful. He was not close enough to make her feel frightened or trapped. He purposefully left a small space, giving her room to finally breathe. "It is time to go," he said, his voice quiet and calm. Martha took a menacing step forward. "Do not ever bring her back here. I will not take her back." Her voice was as sharp and dangerous as a piece of broken glass. The man did not even bother to give her an answer. He simply nudged the horse forward with his heel, and Ruth felt the solid ground shift underneath them. They were finally moving away from the miserable cabin that had been her prison. She did not dare look back. She absolutely could not. She worried that if she turned around one last time, the overwhelming weight of her past might crush her completely. The horse's steady, rhythmic footsteps filled the tense silence between them. Ruth held onto the saddle horn with all her might. Her knuckles had turned completely white from the pressure. She could feel the man's solid presence behind her, a source of warmth and controlled strength. He did not push her to talk or break the silence. He did not bother her with a lot of questions. He simply rode on, as calm as a man whose only mission was to take her to safety. After several long minutes had passed, she finally found her voice. "Why did you do that for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took a slow, deep breath before he answered her question. "Sometimes certain people can only understand one thing in this world, and that one thing is money. I just used the tool that I knew would work." His voice stayed low and quiet. It sounded almost gentle, which was a sound she was not used to. "But please understand, I did not buy you. I simply got you away from her. That is all." Ruth stared straight ahead at the long, empty stretch of road before them. "But you do not even know who I am," she said softly. "No," he said, agreeing with her. "I do not. But I saw enough to know what was right." Her throat felt tight with emotion. She looked down at her own hands resting in her lap. They were trembling from the shock, from the lingering fear, from the weight of everything that had just happened. "So what happens now?" "Now we go into town," he said with confidence. "We are going to see the judge, and we are going to put things right. We will make sure your freedom is legal. The first thing is I want to offer you a position, A real one where you work for me, not for me to own you. After you're on your feet, you can decide what comes next. Ruth blinked slowly, the words taking a moment to register in her tired mind. Work for you, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. You mean like a real job? He nodded, understanding her confusion. Exactly. This is not ownership. You would earn a proper wage, real money that belongs to you and no one else. You would also have a warm room and good meals provided. And most importantly, he added, you will have the complete freedom to leave anytime you choose. The long, shaky breath escaped Ruth's lips, a sound of relief she had been holding in for years. A dum, a wage, a choice. The words echoed in her thoughts, ideas that felt like they belonged to a different person from a lifetime ago. Finally, she found her voice again. What sort of work would I be doing? He considered her question for a moment. General help around the house and kitchen and some work in the garden. And, he added, if you know how to read and write, perhaps you could help me with my account books. A faint, forgotten memory of her father flickered in her mind. My father taught me how to read, she murmured, a distant warmth spreading through her. He always said learning was the one thing no one could ever take away from you. Your father was a very wise man, Cal replied with genuine respect. For a few moments they rode on in a comfortable silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the dusty trail. The road stretched out before them, a long ribbon of dirt disappearing into the horizon. It looked endless, but for the first time Ruth felt it was leading somewhere hopeful. She broke the quiet. I apologize, I never asked your name. My full name is Caleb Reed, he replied, his voice even and calm. But almost everyone just calls me Cal. She tested the name on her tongue, repeating it in a quiet whisper as if it were something precious. Cal. He glanced over at her, his eyes kind. And you are Ruth Avery, is that correct? He said her name with a respect she had not heard in a very long time. She simply nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Cal clicked his tongue gently, skillfully guiding the horse around a deep rut in the road to keep the ride smooth for her. You can lean back and get some rest if you want to, he offered. We still have a good distance to cover. But Ruth couldn't bring herself to rest, not just yet. She was terrified that if she closed her eyes even for a moment, this would all vanish. She could almost feel the cold dread of waking up in that awful, dark cabin, with Martha's cruel and angry face looming over her once again. The chilling thought sent a shiver down her spine. So instead, she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, watching the dusty road unfurl before them. It felt like a lifeline, a real, tangible path leading her away from the darkness of her past. This was a journey she knew she could never, ever have made on her own. After about an hour, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Cal gently pulled back on the reins. We will stop here for a moment, he announced, pulling up near a small, trickling stream. After dismounting, he turned to help her down. Her legs, weak and trembling, almost buckled beneath her. But his strong, steady hands held her arm firmly until she found her balance on the solid ground. You need to drink some water, he said kindly but firmly. Go on and sit for a minute. Ruth gratefully sank onto a smooth, fallen log at the side of the road. She watched as Cal led the weary horse to the edge of the clear stream to let it drink. After the horse was satisfied, he dipped a small tin cup into the cool water. He walked back and offered it to her without saying another word, letting the simple gesture speak for itself. She took the cup with shaky hands and drank slowly. The cool, clean water was a balm to her parched and aching throat. It was only then that she realized just how incredibly thirsty she was. As she handed the cup back, Cal spoke again, his voice soft but sure. It is all right, Ruth. You can finally breathe here. You are safe with me. The quiet sincerity in his tone did something to the tight, painful knot in her chest. She felt it begin to unravel. Logically, she had no reason to trust this stranger she just met. And yet she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was not afraid of him. She was still terrified of Martha, of being found, and of what the future held. She was scared of almost everything else in the world, but somehow not of him. Cal watched her take it all in, his expression patient and understanding. He was not judging her or pushing her for anything. He let her have the moment of peace before speaking again. When we arrive in town, he explained carefully, we will have to go see the judge. He is going to ask if this is what you truly choose. He will ask if you want to start a different life. You do not have to come and work for me if you do not want to, Cal continued, but what is certain is that you are not going back to her. He paused for effect, then added with absolute finality, not ever. Those two powerful words landed deep inside her soul, a solid, unbreakable promise. Not ever. Ruth felt hot tears begin to well up in her eyes. The tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. In her entire difficult life, no one had ever said anything so definite, so incredibly protective. No one had ever offered to stand between her and harm. No one had ever drawn a protective circle around her and declared her safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears and overwhelming emotion. He just gave a single, humble shake of his head. "Do not thank me yet," he said, his voice practical once more. "We still have a very long road ahead of us." With that, he turned back toward the patient horse, ready to continue their journey toward her new life. He methodically tightened the stirrup, then double-checked the worn leather straps. Ruth watched his hands, noticing the calm, deliberate way he moved, and for the very first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a fragile emotion stirring deep inside her chest. It was the beginning of something new, a tiny, flickering spark that felt an awful lot like hope. "We should keep moving," Cal said in his quiet voice. Ruth pushed herself to her feet. Her legs still felt like jelly, but this time she didn't collapse. With his help, they mounted their horses once more. The long, dusty road waited ahead, and the future was a complete unknown. And the very first real question of her new life formed like a whisper in her heart. What in the world comes next? The small town of Red Hollow was just starting to stir as Cal and Ruth rode down the main street. A few weary shop owners were stepping onto their wooden porches, methodically sweeping yesterday's dust from their doorways. The town blacksmith paused, lifting his heavy hammer toward Cal in a silent greeting. Then his eyes landed on Ruth with a look of undisguised and quiet curiosity. It was clear that people noticed every single thing in a small town like this, and they especially paid attention to things that did not fit the usual daily pattern. Ruth sat as straight as a board in her saddle, trying with all her might not to show how deeply nervous she truly felt. Every single pair of eyes felt like a heavy stone, pressing down hard on her shoulders. She kept her hands clenched tightly around the saddle horn, hoping that no one would notice them shaking like a leaf in the wind. Cal expertly guided his horse toward a simple wooden building that served as the town courthouse. "Judge Rowan ought to be here today," he explained calmly. "He makes the trip out here 2 times a month." Ruth could only manage a small nod. She did not trust her own voice to speak just yet. Cal swung down from his horse first, and then he turned to help her down from hers. His hands were so steady, so sure, and surprisingly warm. He did not hold on to her for a moment longer than was necessary. He just offered his strength to give her balance and a sense of safety. For a man who did not know her at all, he seemed to have a deep understanding of exactly what she needed in that moment. Inside, the little courthouse had the distinct smell of old paper, ink, and ancient wood. An older man, Judge Rowan, sat behind a large desk cluttered with ledgers and ink bottles. He carefully pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose as his gaze shifted from Cal to Ruth, taking in the sight of her. "You must be Mitchell?" he asked, looking directly at Cal. "Reed," Cal corrected him gently. "My name is Reed." Then he gestured toward Ruth. "I am here to get employment papers for Miss Avery." The judge stroked his graying jaw thoughtfully. "Employment papers, you say, for this young woman?" Cal stood firm. "Yes, sir. It is a 6-month contract with room and board, plus $1 a day in wages." Judge Rowan then turned his full attention to Ruth, his wise eyes carefully studying her bruised cheek, her exhausted eyes, and her thin, frail frame. "Do you sign this document of your own free will, miss?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. Ruth had to swallow a lump in her throat. "Yes, sir, I certainly do." He leaned forward slightly. "Was there any coercion of any kind?" "No, sir, none at all." The judge gave a single, decisive nod and began to write. The sharp scratching of his pen across the thick paper was the only sound in the room, and each stroke felt like a heavy door closing firmly on her past while another, lighter one was creaking open just ahead. Cal signed the document first, his signature strong and clear. Then it was Ruth's turn. Her hand was trembling so much she could barely hold the pen, but somehow she finished her signature. Her name, Ruth Avery, looked shaky and uncertain on the official page, almost like a stranger's handwriting. The spidery letters looked as though they weren't sure they belonged on such an important document, but they did belong there. That signature was hers, a small mark of her new freedom. Judge Rowan carefully sprinkled blotting sand over the wet ink, a quiet, reassuring gesture. He gently blew the excess sand away and handed her a crisp copy of the contract. "You keep this somewhere very safe now," he said, his voice kind but serious. "This paper is your legal protection under the law." It was a shield, a promise of safety. Ruth clutched the precious document, tucking it inside her worn dress. She held it close to her chest as if it were a fragile bird. Once they were back outside on the dusty street, Cal Reed squinted into the afternoon sun. He looked down the main street toward the row of modest shops. "Are you hungry, Miss Avery?" he asked simply. The word no was already on her lips, a reflex born from years of going without. She was so used to denying her own needs, but her empty stomach betrayed her with a sudden, painful ache. It was a feeling she knew all too well. "Just a little," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. That was all the answer Cal needed. He led the way down the boardwalk toward Patterson's boarding house. Even before they reached the door, a warm, savory smell of beef stew and herbs drifted out to greet them. The delicious aroma promised warmth and nourishment, things Ruth had not dared to dream of. As they stepped inside, a stout, bustling woman named Mrs. Patterson spotted them immediately from behind the counter. "For land's sakes," the woman exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron as she hurried toward them. "Cal Reed, what kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into this time?" "Just a new job, ma'am," Cal replied with a calm, steady voice, gesturing toward Ruth. "I've hired Miss Avery here, Mrs. Ulshashi. Patterson's sharp, inquisitive eyes immediately shifted from Cal to the young woman standing beside him. Her expression softened instantly as she took in Ruth's bruised cheek and the torn hem of her thin dress. The deep exhaustion in Ruth's eyes told a story all its own. "Oh, you poor dear child," she said, her voice full of a sudden warmth. "Come on inside, you two," she murmured, her tone now gentle and motherly. "I'll bring you both a hot meal." Ruth followed her into the cozy dining area, feeling completely unsure of what to do. She did not know how to behave around such genuine kindness. It was a language she no longer spoke. She chose a small, out-of-the-way table near a window, wanting to be as invisible as possible. Cal understood and gave her space, simply sitting across from her, a silent, steady presence. A few moments later, Mrs. Patterson returned carrying a tray with 2 steaming bowls of stew and a basket of freshly baked bread. It might completely change who she was. When she finally came downstairs, she saw Cal waiting patiently by the front door. "You should get some rest now," he said in a low voice. "We will leave first thing in the morning." He gave a polite tip of his hat and turned to step outside into the fading dusk. A strange feeling pulled at her heart. She suddenly did not want him to leave her alone. "Not yet, please." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Cal?" He stopped on the porch. "Yes?" "I have to ask, why did you help me?" The question hung in the quiet air between them for a long moment. The fading sunlight created a stark outline of his broad shoulders, his strong charm, and the rugged lines on his face carved by years of hard work and struggle. He did not look at her when he finally answered, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I grew up with a man who used his fists to solve every problem," he said, his voice heavy. "My own father caused me harm until I was old enough to make him stop. And no one ever stepped in to help. Not one person ever said a single word." He turned then to look her right in the eye. His gaze was steady and deeply serious. "I promised myself I would never watch someone go through that when I could be the one to stop it." Ruth felt a surprising warmth fill her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was something like trust, a small and very fragile seed being planted. "Good night, Ruth," he said, his voice much softer now. "Good night, Cal," she whispered back. He then stepped off the porch and disappeared into the night. She stood there in the safety of the doorway, watching him walk away down the quiet, empty street. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, She did not feel utterly and completely alone. Not truly, not anymore, because someone had seen her. The sun had barely started to rise when Ruth stepped out of the boarding house the very next morning. The cool air felt crisp and clean against her skin, but it was not unpleasant in the slightest. She pulled her new shawl tighter around her and looked down the street for Cal. He stood near the town's hitching post, carefully tightening the saddle straps on his handsome bay horse. When he looked up and saw her, he offered a small, respectful nod. "Did you sleep all right?" he asked. Ruth could only nod in response. She was not sure how she could possibly explain that last night had been the first peaceful, uninterrupted sleep she had been blessed with in many, many years. A real bed, a securely locked door, no angry shouting, no fearful sound of footsteps creeping up the wooden stairs. She had woken up twice during the night, a force of habit, expecting the familiar cold wave of fear to return and grip her heart. But each time she found herself safe and alone in the quiet dark room, she let out a long, slow breath she did not even realize she had been holding inside. Cal offered his steady hand to help her mount the horse. She hesitated for only a brief moment before she accepted it. His grip was firm, strong, and wonderfully steady. "You'll be just fine," he said quietly, seeming to understand her pause. She settled onto the worn leather saddle, and he swung up right behind her. Once again, he was careful to leave a proper space between them, giving her enough room to breathe, enough room for her to feel safe and respected. They rode out of the sleeping town in a comfortable silence. The road ahead stretched out long and dusty under the morning sky. Ruth watched as the world began to wake up and all around them. A distant rancher was already out moving his cattle. A woman was hanging freshly washed laundry on a clothesline. A small boy was joyfully chasing a stray dog, feeling the soft, cool dirt squish between her toes. These were such simple, basic things, but to her they felt incredibly strange and new, like she had been kept in a dark room her whole life, and the light was taking a long time to finally reach her eyes. After a while longer, Cal's calm voice finally spoke. He said, "We will reach my ranch by noon. It is very quiet country out here. There are not many folks around. You will have plenty of space to settle in." Ruth's hands tightened their grip on the saddle horn, her knuckles turning white. "Will people ask a lot of questions?" "Some probably will," he said in an honest tone. "People in small towns always do, but they will lose interest soon enough." He paused for a moment, then looked at her and said, "And I will not let a single person bother you." Those powerful words made something warm begin to move through the center of her chest. It was the feeling of safety. A feeling she still did not fully trust, but it was a feeling she wanted to believe in more than anything. Just as he predicted, around midday, they finally reached the small home Cal had built himself on Willow Bend Ranch. The cozy cabin stood nestled among tall, whispering cottonwood trees, and a large corral stretched out right beside it. Two healthy horses were grazing lazily in the sun. A big, happy dog suddenly ran forward, barking a loud welcome until it saw Ruth. Then it stopped, began to wag its tail, and gently circled her legs. "That is Duke," Cal said with a soft chuckle. "He will probably protect you even faster than I can." Hearing this, Ruth carefully bent down and gently touched the dog's soft head. Duke immediately leaned into her hand as if he had known her his entire life. Cal untied her small flour sack from his saddle and handed it over to her. "This is your home now, Ruth," he said gently, "for as long as you choose to stay." Ruth looked at the little cabin, the welcoming porch, and the quiet, peaceful yard. Home. The word felt too big. The promise felt, too quick. But even so, she took a brave step inside. The cabin smelled faintly of fresh pine and wood smoke, and a sturdy wooden table with two chairs sat in the center. A pot was on the stove, a shelf was filled with tools, and she saw a second room with a narrow bed that she realized with a shock must be hers. She walked over and gently touched the colorful quilt. "Is something the matter?" Cal asked with concern from the doorway. "Oh no," she said back to him quickly. "It is just, this is all much more than I am used to." Cal nodded with understanding. "You do not have to rush anything. Please take the rest of the day to get settled in. I will be right outside with the horses." He then stepped back out, thoughtfully leaving the front door open so she would not feel trapped inside. Ruth slowly placed her very few belongings on the small wooden dresser. There was her mother's old brush, her father's worn Bible, and her one other folded dress. Even with her things there, the room still looked almost empty, but it no longer felt frightening to her. She sat on the edge of the bed, allowing the peaceful quiet to settle all around her. After a good while, she finally went back outside. Cal was standing near the corral, busy mending a broken fence post. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and all of his movements were steady and focused. He looked up the moment he heard her steps. "Are you feeling hungry?" he asked. "A little," she admitted in a quiet voice. He nodded toward the cabin. "Well then, let us fix something to eat." They found themselves cooking side by side in the warm kitchen. Cal went outside and brought in an armful of firewood, the steady rhythm of him chopping it creating a comforting sound. Meanwhile, Ruth carefully sliced potatoes, the small task feeling strangely significant. Their movements were slow and deliberate at first, but soon they fell into an easy, unspoken rhythm. It was a simple dance of two people preparing a meal. She had expected every moment to be filled with a tense, brittle silence. She was braced for awkwardness, for the feeling of being an intruder. But instead, a surprising sense of calm settled over her. It felt like a soft, quiet beginning, like the first gentle rain after a long drought. It was as if she was finally learning how to take a full, deep breath again, without fear catching in her throat. As they sat down to eat the simple meal, she noticed Cal watching her, his gaze careful but not intrusive. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet concern. "You doing all right over there?" he asked gently. She managed a small smile. "I think so," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I just feel adrift." "I really do not know what I am supposed to do next," she admitted. "You do not have to know," he replied, his voice firm and steady. "Just focus on this right here. We will take it one step, one day at a time." After their quiet lunch, Ruth found herself needing to do something with her hands. She helped him sweep the front porch, the simple back and forth motion calming her nerves. Then she insisted on washing the dishes. As she worked, she slowly started to learn the layout of his home. She memorized where Cal kept everything. The flour was stored on the highest shelf, and the heavy ceramic bowls were neatly stacked in the lower cabinet. The old-fashioned kettle had its own special hook right next to the stove. These small, ordinary tasks were like an anchor, grounding her in the present moment. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, a new sound broke the peace. A lone rider was approaching the ranch. The steady beat of the horse's hooves against the dirt made Ruth go completely still. Her entire body tensed up, and her hands froze on the damp dish rag she was holding. She was holding the wash rag so tightly her knuckles turned white. Cal noticed the change in her immediately and moved to stand beside her on the porch, a silent, solid presence. "It is all right," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "That is just Levi. He is my foreman," Cal explained quietly. The rider, Levi, swung down from his horse with an easy grace and a friendly smile on his face. "Heard you might be bringing someone home, Cal," he called out. Levi's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I just did not know it would be such a lovely lady." Ruth felt a surprising warmth spread across her cheeks, a blush she had not felt in a very long time. Levi politely tipped his hat in her direction. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. But Cal's voice cut in, holding a sharp, protective edge. "Levi, she is under my care here. Make sure you spread that around and make it clear," Cal finished. Levi's friendly expression turned serious, and he nodded, understanding the unspoken message perfectly. "You have got my word, boss." Hearing the exchange, Ruth felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach relax just a little. Levi, to his credit, shifted the conversation effortlessly, telling Cal about a section of broken fence down near the south grazing field. The talk turned to ranch business, a world that was completely new to her. Cal listened intently to the report, offering simple, direct answers. Together, they made a plan for the two of them to handle the repairs. They decided they would head out to fix the fence first thing tomorrow morning. After Levi mounted his horse and rode away, a quiet settled over the porch again. Ruth took a hesitant step closer to Cal. "Are people going to start talking? Are they all going to talk about me being here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe," Cal answered honestly, not trying to sugarcoat it. "But you need to know that talk does not bite." He met her gaze. "And I give you my solemn promise, I will not let anyone's cruel words get anywhere near you." Ruth turned her head and looked out across the vast, open land stretching before them. The setting sun was painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. She saw his dog, Duke, lying peacefully in the tall grass, and felt the quiet, immense stretch of the ranch all around her. It was a peaceful, beautiful sight. For the first time in forever, she felt something shift deep inside of her. It was a tiny, fragile sense of belonging, but it was there. She turned back to him. Cal, she said. She whispered his name, and he turned his full attention toward her. Yes, he prompted gently. I am still so scared, she confessed, the words tumbling out. He just nodded once, his expression showing no surprise at all. He seemed to have been expecting her to say it. I know that, he said. Fear does not just go away overnight, but I need you to believe that you are safe here with me. I promise you that. And I will do everything in my power to keep you that way. A gentle evening wind rustled the leaves on the trees, moving softly between them. Ruth held his gaze, refusing to look away this time, and neither did Cal. For a long, significant moment, neither of them spoke a single word. Then a new sound cut through the stillness, the faint but unmistakable sound of more distant hooves approaching. The sound broke the quiet moment between them. Instantly, Cal's entire expression changed. His face became serious, and his eyes were sharp and alert. Stay right here, close to me, he commanded. He said it quietly, but with an urgency that sent a jolt of fear through her. Ruth felt her heartbeat, which had finally started to slow, suddenly jump into a frantic rhythm in her chest. Someone else was coming to the ranch. As the figure of the rider grew larger and clearer on the horizon, Ruth instinctively took a step back, seeking the safety of the shadows on the porch. She moved back until her shoulder brushed against Cal's strong arm. She did not grab onto him, but she made sure to stay as close as she possibly could, her eyes fixed on the approaching threat. The sound of the approaching horse was so close now that Ruth imagined she could feel the vibration in her own chest, her breath catching with every heavy hoofbeat. Cal, however, stood as still as an old oak tree. He remained perfectly straight, with one hand resting casually near the smooth wooden handle of his holstered gun. It wasn't an open threat, but it was a clear statement of readiness. The rider finally reined his horse in, slowing to a halt a few yards from the porch. A tall, imposing man swung himself down from the saddle, taking a moment to slap the trail dust from the sleeves of his worn jacket. His eyes, sharp and cold, slid right past Cal and landed directly on Ruth. His stare stayed on her for a moment too long, making her skin crawl. Good afternoon, the stranger said, his voice a low drawl that didn't sound friendly at all. The name is Barrett Hayes. I'm out here looking for some honest work. Cal's expression didn't change one bit. We are not hiring anyone right now, he stated plainly. Ruth felt a cold, prickling shiver race up the length of her spine. There was something about this man that felt deeply wrong, like a shadow falling over a sunny day. His smile was all sharp edges, and his eyes were far too bold and invasive. Barrett simply shrugged his wide shoulders. That's a real shame. I heard you have a whole lot of good land here and only one man trying to keep it all up. We manage just fine on our own, Cal replied, his voice level and firm. Barrett's unsettling gaze traveled slowly back to Ruth, a flicker of something unpleasant in his eyes. I did not know you had such lovely company all the way out here in the middle of nowhere, he said, his words dripping with insinuation. Cal took a small but deliberate step forward. She is under my protection, Cal said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Barrett tilted his head, a mocking smirk playing on his lips. And is that supposed to mean something important to me? It absolutely should, Cal answered quietly. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Duke let out a low, rumbling growl from his spot on the porch. Barrett's gaze flicked to the big dog for a second, then quickly scanned the front of the cabin, lingering on the nearest window as if measuring it. Ruth fought to keep her composure, to look brave, but her hands were twisting the fabric of her skirt into a tight knot. Barrett finally let out a short, humorless laugh. All right, no need to get heated. I was just passing through the area, that is all. Cal offered no reply. He did not need to say a word. His powerful silence and unwavering stance drew a clear line in the dirt between them. With a final, lingering look, Barrett mounted his horse again. I will see you folks around, he called out, his voice carrying a veiled promise. He guided his horse away at a slow, deliberate trot, and his eyes remained fixed directly on Ruth until the swirling dust of the trail finally swallowed him from view. When he was truly gone, Ruth exhaled a long, shaky breath she hadn't even realized she had been holding inside her lungs. "Cal, who on earth was that man?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cal slowly shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the empty trail. "He is a drifter. He is the kind that roams around looking for easy money or an opportunity to cause trouble. He will take whichever one he finds first." Ruth swallowed hard against the lump of fear in her throat. "Do you honestly think he will come back?" Cal looked at her then, and he did not lie. "It's possible." A knot of pure fear tightened in her chest. Seeing the look on her face, Cal immediately softened his voice. "You are safe here with me," he said gently but firmly. "I truly meant what I said out there, and I will always stand by it." Ruth could only nod, though her heart was still pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She followed him back inside the small cabin, desperate to be surrounded by solid walls and the comforting warmth of the familiar room. She needed a barrier to hide her from the vast, unpredictable world outside. Cal moved to light the oil lamp, and then set a kettle of water on the stove to heat. "Go on and sit down," he said softly. She took a seat at the little wooden table while he moved methodically around the small, cozy room. He walked over and checked that the door latch was secure. He then went to each window and carefully closed the wooden shutters. He didn't explain why, but she knew. She understood perfectly. That man, Barrett Hayes, had unsettled him deeply too. When Cal finally took the chair across the table from her, the silence was filled with their shared worry. Ruth found herself studying him, watching the way the firelight cast shadows on his strong face and how his jaw tightened when he was deep in thought. She noticed he seemed worried, the way his large, calloused hands would flex for a moment before resting calmly on the table again. "You are not angry, are you?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "For me being so scared back there?" "No, Ruth," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Fear is not a weakness. It is a strength," he continued, his voice steady. "Fear means you understand what real danger looks like, and you have survived it." Her eyes immediately lowered to her lap. "I have known what it looks like for a very long time," she admitted in a small voice. Cal heard the history in those words and did not push her to say more. He never did. He never pressured her, but something about his patient silence made her feel safe, like he was inviting her to finally speak. And so, slowly, she found the courage. "My stepmother," she began, testing the words. "She was not always so cruel. Not in the beginning, but after my dear papa passed away. Well, that is when everything changed completely. Suddenly, my whole life became one long punishment. Every tiny mistake I made turned into another reason for her to scream at me. Or worse," her voice trembled with the memory. "She once forced me to sleep outside in the yard, in the freezing cold, all because I accidentally spilled a little of her evening tea." Cal's hands tightened around his own mug, his knuckles turning white. "That was not your fault," he said, his voice a low growl. "But in her house, everything was my fault," Ruth whispered, the old shame washing over her. He leaned forward. He leaned in just a little, closing the distance between them. Then she was wrong. The silence that followed felt warm and safe, not heavy or awkward. It was filled with a sense of understanding, a feeling Ruth had not known for so long she could not even name it. She watched the firelight as it danced across Cal's rugged face. He had such strong features, but such incredibly kind eyes. This was a good man, a man who did not run away from his responsibilities. "You told me once that your own father caused you pain," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. Cal looked into the heart of the fire for a long moment before he finally answered. "Yes, he did. He hurt me until the day I was old enough and strong enough to stop him for good." A new question formed in her mind. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "Every single day," he said, so simply and without a trace of shame. Ruth's breath caught in her chest. "Then how did you ever get past it?" His answer surprised her. "I did not," he said. "Not completely, but I did learn something very important from all that pain." He met her eyes with a serious gaze. You do not, you do not heal from something like that by pretending it did not hurt. You heal by building a new life, by finding a place that does not feel like that old pain anymore. Ruth's eyes instantly warmed with unshed tears. She blinked furiously, fighting to hold them back. Is this ranch that place for you? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Cal took a long moment to think, his gaze sweeping over the cozy cabin. Then he slowly nodded, a small, genuine smile on his face. Yes, it is, and it can be that place for you too. As he spoke, the kettle on the stove began to whistle softly. Ruth did not dare to move, not wanting to break the precious, fragile peace between them. Cal stood up and walked over to the stove. He poured the steaming hot water into 2 mugs he had prepared. A fragrant cloud of herbal tea steam rose gently into the cozy air. He brought one over and placed the warm cup on the table in front of her. She immediately wrapped her cold hands around it, letting the deep, soothing warmth soak right into her very bones. Thank you, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the cup. You do not owe me any thanks for this, he replied kindly. She finally lifted her head to look right at him, and her voice shook with emotion. I was not thanking you for saving my life. I was thanking you for seeing me, she clarified, her eyes shining in the firelight. For truly seeing me. Cal held her gaze for a long, silent breath. I see you, Ruth, he said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. More than you will ever know. Her heart did a little flutter, not with fear, but with a feeling of hope. From fear, but from something entirely different. Something gentler and much warmer that she did not have a name for yet. They simply sat together in the quiet cabin, listening to the fire crackle as the light outside softened and faded into a deep, purple evening. After a long, comfortable silence, Cal finally pushed himself to his feet. I should go check on the horses before it gets completely dark out there. Please stay inside and lock the door until I get back, he said, his voice soft. Ruth could only nod, watching as he stepped out into the twilight. But before he could even take 3 steps toward the barn, Duke's sudden sharp growl shattered the peaceful quiet of the evening. Cal froze instantly. Another deep growl rumbled from the dog's chest. A moment later, there was a distinct rustle in the trees just beyond the clearing. It was clear that something, or someone, was lurking out there in the shadows. Cal's hand instinctively went to the holster on his hip. At the sound, Ruth appeared in the doorway, her heart pounding as that old, familiar fear flooded her chest once more. Cal, she whispered, her voice barely audible, laced with panic. He did not turn to look at her, his focus locked on the darkness. Get back inside now, he commanded, his tone firm. A flicker of movement by the tree line caught his eye. Cal stood perfectly still, a statue of concentration, his gaze fixed on that spot. Duke growled again, a low and steady warning this time, the fur raised in a ridge all along his powerful back. Ruth was frozen where she stood in the doorway, unable to move a muscle. Behind her, the kettle on the stove still hissed softly with leftover heat, but the only sounds she could hear were Duke's threatening growl and the frantic, rushing sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Cal took one slow, careful step forward. Stay inside the house, Ruth, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. But she did not move. She absolutely could not. It felt as if her feet were nailed to the floorboards, held in place by pure terror. A shadow detached itself from the darkness between 2 large cottonwood trees. With a slow, deliberate motion, Cal drew his gun, his movements smooth and careful, not wanting to spook whatever or whoever was watching them from the edge of the woods. For a long, tense moment, it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. Then the shadow stepped casually into the dim light of the clearing. It was not a stranger, not some drifter. It was the last person they wanted to see. Barrett Hayes. He leaned against a tree with an arrogant air, as if he owned the entire ranch. He had his hat tilted low over his eyes, and a cold smile played on his lips, but never reached his eyes. Good evening, he said, his voice smooth and mocking. This is a nice little place you have got here, Reed. Cal did not lower his weapon, not even by an inch. You are trespassing on my property. Property, Hayes. You need to leave. Barrett just shrugged his shoulders, completely unconcerned. Land is just land. I did not know it was a crime to take a walk through it. It is when you're standing there staring at my home, Cal said, his voice turning to ice. Barrett's calculating eyes slid right past Cal, landing directly on Ruth, who was still standing in the doorway. Her breath caught in her throat. "Is that her?" Barrett asked, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Is that the girl you bought for yourself with a big stack of dollars?" Ruth felt her stomach clench into a tight, painful knot, the shame washing over her. Cal took a half step to his left, deliberately blocking Barrett's line of sight to Ruth. "You do not talk about her," Cal said, his voice a low growl. "Not now, not ever." Barrett just chuckled, a nasty, humorless sound. "Easy there, Reed. I'm just a curious man. It is hard to believe you would go to all that trouble and expense for such a small slip of a girl." Cal's jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "You are leaving, right now." Barrett slowly raised his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. All right, all right. No need to get your temper up." He slowly backed away a few steps, never taking his eyes off them. "But if you ever decide you need some real help running this ranch, you know exactly where to find me. After all, a man like you cannot possibly do all this work alone." Cal did not say a word, just watched him go. Dunn gave a slow, deliberate tip of his wide-brimmed hat, a gesture that felt more like a warning than a goodbye, before he vanished into the deep shadows of the forest. Cal waited until the rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves grew faint, finally dissolving into the quiet evening air, before he slowly lowered his heavy rifle. Duke let out a soft whine and settled at his feet. Ruth finally found the courage to step out from the doorway, her legs trembling so much she had to grip the frame for support. "Cal," she asked, her voice a shaky whisper, "why was that man here?" Cal kept his gaze on the dark, imposing line of trees where the man had disappeared, his expression grave. "Men like that," he said slowly, "are like predators. They circle places where they think they can find weakness. I will not let him circle this home." Ruth swallowed hard against the lump of fear in her throat. "I do not want to bring you any trouble. I never wanted to be a burden." At her words, Cal turned to face her, his movement quick and his expression firm. "Listen to me, Ruth. You are not trouble. You have never been." Then his voice softened, losing its hard edge and becoming gentle. "He saw a woman living alone and made a bad judgment. He thought you would be an easy person to intimidate. He thought you were an easy target, but he is completely and utterly wrong." Ruth's eyes fell to the dusty ground. "That is only because you are here." "No," Cal corrected her immediately. His tone was gentle but firm. "It is because you have already survived things a man like him could never even imagine. You have a strength inside you that you do not even see yet. You are so much stronger than you think." For the first time all evening, a flicker of warmth returned to her eyes as tears welled up, and one traced a silent path down her cheek. "I do not feel strong at all." Cal shook his head slightly. "True strength is not about being loud or boastful," he explained. "Most of the time, real strength is quiet. It is the decision to get up in the morning when every part of you wants to stay down." Moved by his words, Ruth took a hesitant step closer to him, not daring to touch. She stood near enough to feel the comforting warmth radiating from him, a silent promise of safety. Her voice was quiet again. "Cal, do you think he will come back?" He answered honestly, not giving her false hope. "It is possible, but if he does, he will find me right here, waiting for him." A soft evening wind swept across the yard. The immediate danger had passed, but something new had taken its place. A quiet, unspoken closeness had settled between them in the fading light. That feeling of connection remained, warm and solid in the cool air. Ruth found herself studying Cal's steady profile, noticing the gentle but firm set of his jaw. She saw the fierce sense of calm he wore like a protective shield, not just for himself, but for her too. In a soft voice, she whispered, "I am so glad that I am here." Her quiet confession made Cal's breath catch in his chest for just a moment. He turned his head to meet her gaze. "I am glad you are here too, Ruth." Together they turned and went back into the safety of the small cabin. Cal moved around the room, making sure all the wooden shutters were securely latched for the night. Meanwhile, Ruth lit the oil lamp on the table. The warm, golden glow chased away the shadows, making the cabin walls feel cozy. She stood by the table, watching. Her heart was filled with a quiet gratitude that was too deep for words. "Cal," she began softly, I am not sure what my place is supposed to be in your life. I do not know if I am a worker or a temporary guest or something else entirely. He finished with the last shudder and pause, turning to face her. He truly looked at her, seeing the brave woman standing there. You are someone who deserves to have peace, Waiton. That is what you are, he said. And I promise you, as long as you are living under my roof, you will have it. A powerful emotion swelled in her chest, making it feel tight. The feeling almost took her breath away, and she finally asked the real question. Do you actually want me to stay? Yes, Cal answered immediately, without a single moment of doubt. His answer was swift and sure. But it is very important that it is your choice. I only want you to stay if you freely choose to. Hearing this, Ruth began to walk toward him. She took slow, deliberate steps, feeling her hands begin to tremble. Her heart fluttered in her chest like a captured bird. I do choose it, she said, her voice full of emotion. She spoke the words in a soft whisper, but they held all the conviction in the world. A look of warm relief washed over Cal's features. Then this is your home now, Ruth. Another tear escaped and slipped down her cheek, but this time it was a tear of pure happiness. Thank you, she breathed, the words full of unspoken gratitude. He took that final small step that closed the distance between them, moving with care and respect. Ruth, he said, his voice incredibly gentle, you do not owe me any thanks for this. You do not owe me anything at all. He shook his head gently. If anything, it is me who owes you. You give this place more genuine warmth than it has known in too many years to count. Ruth looked up at him, her gaze searching his, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the silence of the room. It was barely a breath when she said, I just want to live someplace where I feel safe and where I know I am wanted. Cal's response was immediate and sure, leaving no room for doubt. You are wanted here, he said, his voice low and sincere, every single day. The very air in the small cabin seemed to become charged with a gentle warmth. There was no hurry, no pressure to say or do more. It was just two people standing close enough to feel the quiet comfort of the other's presence. They were close enough to hear the sound of each other's breathing in the quiet room. After a long moment, Ruth reached out first, a small, brave gesture. Her fingertips, hesitant at first, lightly brushed against the back of his calloused hand. Cal did not move, did not pull away in the slightest. He stood perfectly still, accepting her touch. And with that simple connection, a quiet understanding settled over them like a warm blanket. It was a moment that felt soft, slow, and entirely real. It was not quite a promise, not yet, but it felt like the seeds of one were being planted right there, in the warmth of the cabin. Outside, the world was settling down. Duke, the loyal dog, was already curled up on the porch, a furry guardian. Above them, the vast sky deepened from twilight purple into a starry night, and the ranch settled into a peaceful stillness for the night. And inside that cozy cabin, protected from the world, Ruth finally gave herself permission to believe the truth that had been taking root in her heart. She was no longer alone in this world, and just as importantly, she was never going back to the fearful life she had left behind. That chapter of her story was finally and completely closed. This time, when she thought about tomorrow, the future felt like a wide-open prairie, full of possibility instead of peril. And with a newfound strength, she stepped toward it without fear. What a beautiful new beginning for her. Now, if this story touched your heart in any way tonight, I would be so honored if you would consider joining our little family of story lovers right here on this channel. Your subscription does more than just add a number. It helps keep these timeless, Wild West stories alive and coming your way. And I want you to know that support truly means the world to me. If you think you would like to hear more tales of dangerous journeys, hard-won love, and the incredible power of second chances out on the American frontier, then please take a moment to hit that subscribe button before you ride on out of here. I am so grateful that you decided to spend your valuable time with me tonight, partner. It truly means a lot. Until then, take care, and I will see you in the next story.